At one point, Lacan said, I think at top of my head, I think in seminar 10 or anxiety, I think he said the pervert here, the masochist, he or she really, her or his aim is really not jouissance. It is what the masochist seeks is the anxiety in the sadist, right? And so here, from the point of, from the perspective of the sadist, the aim of the sadist is to give jouissance to the other, right? But this other who receives that performance actually doesn't seek jouissance, but rather seeks anxiety to the pervert. So here the question is, who's actually getting the enjoyment? To whom the enjoyment belong? And here I think that the question of witness is highly interesting. I don't really have a clear formulation and answer to it, but I am only raising a question here: where is actually jouissance? Where is the enjoyment? Whose enjoyment is this in perversion?
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of Laplanche and Pontalus's paper Fantasy and the Origins of Sexuality. And you know, of course, they do this task of going through Freud and trying to elaborate and in a way almost systematize a theory of fantasy. So the beating fantasies, a child is being beaten, is crucial for them. But one of the points they make, I mean, you see it in Lacan as well, of course, but is this, that in a fantasy scenario like that, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly where the subject is precisely, actually. So that's not just, you know, something that's kind of anomalous, but it's there on purpose, because you could say that the fantasy is distributed between the various people involved in the scenario. Hence also, of course, the fact that Lacan will go on to speak about the logic of fantasy, which suggests that there's a series of arrangements. So I kind of like that you're complicating the picture for us. Maybe just to add, though, I think it's quite right. It's not necessarily straightforward, and that reminds me also of Darren Leader's new book on jouissance, where, you know, he also tries to complicate these things. He says, well, you know, who's jouissance? Sometimes the concept is used in a slightly vague or blurry way, but one reference point is to something you'd said already, was that if there's a contract, you could say that by definition, what we could call a so-called perverse interaction is never just a kind of one and a second person, because there's also a contract. So there's an instantiation of the other in some kind of perverse scenario, I suppose we could.
Very nice. That's very nice.
What about, I've been listening carefully, and I was wondering if you had mentioned disavowal, and disavowal hasn't yet been mentioned, which I kind of like, actually, because sometimes, you know, we always proceed in the Lacanian literature, well, what is perversion? Perversion is a psychic structure that is there because disavowal is the predominant mode of negation and defense, you know, which is important, but it's kind of challenging and interesting to also approach it from a series of other coordinates, which is exactly what you've done. But I can't resist to but ask, what about disavowal?
I must have disavowed of talking about it. I don't know why it didn't come out. In fact, I was actually thinking about it. Oh, I haven't mentioned it yet, disavowal. So, yes, fetishism of the disavowal of phallus and disavowal of castration. Again, if we talk about perversion as a fantasy structure, I think absolutely disavowal of the phallus and castration is relevant. If we talk about perversion in the structure of psychosis at the level of language, it does have some response to it, but then how? That's a more complicated question. But I think it's true at the very traditional kind, sort of Freudian, Lacanian level, that the pervert, especially the perversion that is circumscribed by object gaze, right? The scopic drive is very, very important point here. So Lacan talks about here is that the voyeur, like here imagines the woman behind the curtain on the stage, right? And even if he sees the hairy ugly man, the voyeur imagines, he disavows the very fellows there to tell him that it's actually the reality is the fairy man. But the disavowal is so powerful that the scopic drive creates a beautiful woman still, right, to the voyeur. So I think what we can extract from this disavowal of the phallus and castration is, I think, something that Jacques Miller has talked about, is the ironic clinic. And he talked about the ironic clinic in the context of actually perversion and delusion, in ordinary psychosis, right? In other words, this kind of voyeuristic disavowal, or scopic disavowal, is not something, again, it's extraordinary, something that takes place in our ordinary, at the level of ordinary life. To say that is that delusion is something everyday psychic reaction, psychic formation, reaction formation. And so we can even say something like that this kind of perversion at the level of scopic drive may be something kind of ordinary delusion or ordinary perversion that we may all experience. Maybe it's at the unconscious level, then not all of us can actually think about that, whether that I need a treatment or not, but it's to the point where that it is very prevalent in our everyday desire, I think, and not necessarily jouissance. So I like to tie this disavowal and a perversion not as something now, it's something now, okay, it's a new discovery, but perhaps in the everyday delusion, everyday ordinary delusion.
Great, thank you. Could you tell us about perversion? Perversion, sorry, no, non-existent.
Yeah. No,
so the term coined, the neologism that Lacan refers to later on in his teaching, which presumably is like a condensation of perversion and father-version or something.
right.
What can you tell us about that, Meera?
Yeah, so that notion, that the neologism appears in his very late teaching and late teaching on in his writing on choice and symptom. So just to give a very summing up of what is perversion in theoretical terms is that so there are three orders in the Lacanian. So those of you, again, viewers who are not familiar with the Lacanian idea, is that we have three orders here. Here, the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. But here in this moment, Lacan create or added to that order, three orders, another link, another order, fourth link and fourth order. It's the name of the father, right? And he uses various languages such as the name of the father, perversion, a virgin of the father, or virgins of the father, or virgin toward the father. So what Lacan highlights in this fourth link in what he calls the Borromean nod is that in psychosis, so here he really talks about the structure or the clinic of psychosis, right? When the name of the father or symbolic is foreclosed in psychosis, it appears in or as the real. But in fact, again, that's not the end. That's not the end of the story in psychosis in the Lacanian sense, right? In fact, looking at examining Joyce's writing or Joyce's even biography, he was able to sustain his life despite this kind of schizophrenic, the foreclosure of the father, even actually literally repudiating his own biological father. He actually disowned his own biological father, but he was able to sustain his writing and creativity and everything. So I think Lacan in this context, Lacan said, in fact, there's a fourth link that holds, that sort of holds everything together. that is the name of the father. But this name of the father doesn't have to be, doesn't have to be a father figure necessarily, or caretaker that Freud talks about, but any kind of form, right, that that invokes certain kind of effect, pacifying effect, and what Lacan calls something like a quilting point, right, is perversion. So that's why we interpret that as there are many different versions and forms of the father. And that's what I think Lacan was trying to say. But what another important aspect that I'd like to highlight here is that these people don't really quote this expression from the seminar much. Lacan also said, we need a new version of perversion in the seminar 20. And so I was thinking of what did he really mean by the new version of perversion? And this, I returned to my earlier comments on this brief description of what is Lacanian perverse structures. And my third point was that perversion at the level of language, perversion at the level of the name of the father as another version of the father. So I think it's nicely that pun, homophony, or neologism of the perversion, right, and perversion, a version of father, come very nicely together. So then here at this point, perversion has nothing to do really any sexual libido or sexuality, but it had really tied, it really at the level of symbolic function, right, paternal function that we talked about, that is given by some form of what father names, in the form of the names that father gives.
The question of creativity, of writing, of the inventiveness that can go along with perversion is a particularly fascinating topic. I feel like I'd like to launch into a whole conversation all about that, actually, but that's perhaps for another time. But what I think is also useful about that is, listening to your account of perversion, we start to get a good sense of what perversion is not in Lacan and in Freud. Well, let's focus on Lacan, but we know that it's not something that's reducible to biology. Right. We also know, in terms of what you've been saying, that perversion is not reducible to acts or to certain types of content, hence the reference to form. We also know that it's not necessarily a pathology. So maybe just as we draw to a conclusion, it might be useful to get a sense of some of the things that it's not. Another thing, incidentally, the fourth one is, it's not necessarily overtly about what we would normally recognize as, explicitly sexual, actually. Previously when we've chatted about this, I think, I forget if it was me or you, but we mentioned this example that Slavoj Žižek draws on, about an act of murder, political murder, kind of fundamentalists' murder, where the murderer is, in a sense, really instantiating this, I am the instrument of the other's jouissance. So I wonder if you had any comments on that. We know that in a Lacanian framework, perversion is not biology. Perversion is not simply reducible to one or two or three acts. We know that it's not necessarily pathological. I mean, and in that respect, we could draw a line all the way back to Freud's polymorphous perversity. And we know it can be creative. Those seem to me very important characterizations. What should we add to that? Or what comes to mind when we speak about perversion in those terms?
We already talked about it, and you really nicely elucidated all this, by the way, what are not perversions. That brings us to then what is perversion. And I think what I like to add to that is actually, I already talked about it, but pervertibility of language. I think that is what's unique about Lacan's perversion, which we don't immediately see again in Freud's notion of perversion. Pervertibility of language is again, one says one thing, but it doesn't mean that, and it means something else. But also that the enunciation might have not come from the very subject of speaking. It might have come from the other, right? So that disparity of the statement and enunciation, I think precisely because of the disparity, that non-mutuality, which I think it's a very perverse function of language. I think that is what really is a perversion in the Lacanian sense. So again, if there was no language, if there was no written contract, if there was no fiction, written fiction, where do we find perversion? It's only in the bedroom, right? It's only in the bedroom. So I think this is the philosophy in the bedroom, right? Is it's not the sex in the bedroom, it's not the sexuality in the bedroom, it's the philosophy in the bedroom, right? So I think this distorted function of language, I think, is what really brings to the fore of sexuality, but not in a reciprocal way. I think this is why that Lacan formulated this, the maxim that everyone speaks of these days is no sexual rapport. There's no such thing as sexuality. So if we think about it, perhaps even perversion is a linguistic structure. Perhaps it's not even fantasy structure. Perhaps it's not even psychical structure. Perhaps it's not even clinical structure. Perhaps it's a structure of logic. Perhaps it's within the structure of language, linguistic structure. Then we have it every day. We have it in every instant of our speech. I think that's what it's really radical and fascinating, revolutionary about Lacan's perversion. It's that insofar as one speaks, there's already perversion. And there's then already the signifier of sexuality. That's what I like to highlight.